Willpower, the accidentally brilliant life of William Shakespeare. Part 1. The bungled birth of a bard. Chapter 1. The faint-hearted infant. William Shakespeare was born, quite inconveniently, during a thunderstorm, a local turnip shortage, and what historians now call the slightly drippy ceiling crisis of Stratford-upon-Avon. His mother, Mary Arden, had intended to name him something solid, respectable and biblical, like Ezekiel or Kevin. But at the precise moment of his birth, the infant emerged fists first and allegedly cried in perfect iambic pentameter, "O cruel womb, too tight and far too moist, I now emerge, milkless and disappointed." The midwife fainted. The milkmaid wept. The cow responsible for the household's dairy supply reportedly dried up on the spot and walked into the river out of artistic solidarity. Thus, William Shakespeare entered the world as both a literary prodigy and a local inconvenience. His father, John Shakespeare, a man whose primary career ambition was to avoid ambition, looked down at his wailing son and said, "He seems a bit faint-hearted, doesn't he?" The phrase stuck, mostly because no one had ever heard it before, and everyone in town thought it sounded dreadfully clever. That's how it worked back then. Say something mildly coherent and congratulations, you've coined the English language. Naturally, William's early years were riddled with signs of genius. At age 1, he ate an entire inkpot and recited his first haiku. At age 2, he built a crude puppet theatre out of discarded mutton bones and staged a play titled Much Bleat About Nothing. The cast was exclusively goats. Critics were torn, literally, by the goats. And yet, for all this precocious brilliance, young William was, by every account, a deeply odd child. He was afraid of spoons but trusted forks implicitly. He insisted on wearing 2 hats, even to bed. He once claimed to have invented the art of dramatic pausing by staring meaningfully into his porridge for over 17 minutes. The porridge, unable to bear the tension, curdled. Will's emotional spectrum ranged from tragically contemplative to melancholically smug. He would often walk into a room, sigh loudly and whisper, "Lo, I have entered." He had no friends. By age 4, he had already composed his first complete tragedy, Hamlet's Hamster, in which the titular rodent is murdered in Act 1, mourned for 5 acts and avenged via a rogue trebuchet operated by a grieving duck. This was also the age he developed a lifelong fear of ducks, having been bitten on the shin by one during a particularly immersive rehearsal. His diary from that year reads, "The duck, unbidden, did bite me. I shall not forgive. Nay, nevermore, feathery beast. The stage is thine enemy." Shakespeare's education began at the Stratford Grammar School, a place with rigorous academic standards, questionable hygiene policies, and a Latin teacher who pronounced all vowels as if perpetually annoyed. William was a top student in everything except math, science, physical education, and attendance. He preferred writing poetry on stale bread and shouting metaphors at passing strangers. Once, when asked to recite a biblical passage, he instead delivered a spontaneous sonnet about a squirrel's internal struggle with identity. The class applauded. The squirrel sued for libel. It was during this formative time that he discovered the concept of a soliloquy, which he originally defined as arguing with oneself so eloquently that even the furniture begins to feel guilty. His parents worried, mostly about property damage, but also that he'd never take a real job. At 6, Will began referring to his sandbox as the Globe and staged full-scale productions using worms as extras. His mother tried to intervene, once hiring a child therapist, though the concept hadn't been invented yet, so it was mostly a shoemaker who asked philosophical questions. When asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Will replied, dramatically misunderstood. He was on track to succeed. By age 7, he was banned from 3 local churches for rewriting hymns to include subplots. At 8, he published his first controversial pamphlet, To Pee or Not to Pee, a chamber pot meditation, which was promptly banned for sacrilegious plumbing metaphors. At 9, he coined the phrase, "What's done is done," after accidentally setting fire to the family pantry and refusing to apologize. "Shall I repent?" he'd said dramatically. "Nay, I shall monologue." His mother, holding a scorched pie tin, simply muttered, "What's done is done." William, in shock, blinked. "Oh, I like that." He then scribbled it down on his forearm, which was, at the time, covered in gravy and minor third-degree burns. Thus, another quote was born. Years later, he'd used that very line in Macbeth, though scholars debate whether it was a thematic comment on fate or just Will lazily recycling things his mum said when she was tired of his nonsense. In retrospect, most of Shakespeare's creative genius came from 1. Mishearing things. 2. Making stuff up. 3. Stealing from people who couldn't read. He was a collector of overheard insults and emotionally charged vegetables. He once claimed he could write a tragedy using nothing but items found in his father's sock drawer and one traumatic duck encounter. The result? King Lear, possibly. Behind the phrase TM, faint-hearted. Origin. William's father, trying to sound deep while panicking over a newborn that looked like a poet and cried like a thesaurus. Modern use. Describes someone who won't watch horror films, eat spicy food, or date actors. Chapter 2. Much Ado About Teething. Infancy was a difficult period for young William, largely because he treated it like an audition. Most babies fussed. Some cried. William, however, was known to growl, glare, and gnaw menacingly at the furniture like a tiny, emotionally unstable playwright with something to prove, which, in fairness, he was. By the time he was 8 months old, William Shakespeare had already chewed through 7 cradles, 1 set of priestly robes, 2 of his mother's good wooden spoons, and the corner of the family Bible, specifically Revelations, which he declared overwrought. His parents attempted every known remedy of the time: tinctures of thyme, smudging with burnt leeches, gently whispering to the gums, an early form of dental ASMR, and finally letting him gnaw on a chilled leg of mutton until he passed out from satisfaction or exhaustion. No one could ever tell. But Will's molars were militant. He didn't teeth, he raged. One local nursemaid said, "'Tis no normal babe. He doth bite with purpose, like he's trying to rewrite God." She quit immediately after he bit through her corset laces mid-baptism. And so the legend began to form. This child, this toothsome terror of Stratford, was no ordinary boy. He was bard-born, or as the local barber put it, "That lad's gonna chew his way to the top, mark me." They marked him all right, mostly with warning signs carved into church pews and baby gates. "Beware the boy with the jaws of hell." Teething turned out to be a creative period for William. During one particularly feverish chompfest, he bit his own wrist in frustration and, upon tasting his own blood, reportedly cried out, "Oh, that my wit had teeth to match my woes." To which his mother replied, "Oh, Will, stop being dramatic. It's only a splinter." But the phrase stuck, and just like that, biting wit was born, though it would take another decade and 2 public brawls with a jester before it entered the broader lexicon. One observer at the time, a local thatcher with a suspiciously detailed diary, wrote, "Today the lad bit a hole through a stool and then laughed maniacally. Said something about feasting on irony. I don't think he knows what irony is." He didn't, but that never stopped him. As William's teeth came in, so too did his talent for biting observations, usually delivered in iambic tantrums. By age 1, he had perfected a look that could wither plants and a scowl that once made a bishop weep. The bishop was fine but emotionally shaken. It was also around this time that Will developed an early fascination with insults. His favourites included "Thou spleeny, knotty-pated knave," "Thou crusty batch of haggard squirrel juice," and a personal favourite, "Thy mother's pies offend me by smell alone." These were considered edgy, even by Renaissance standards. The local gooseherder called him a menace wrapped in ruffles, which was both accurate and generously poetic. His parents, in a desperate bid to channel his aggression into something less destructive, introduced him to parchment. Their hope was simple: maybe he'd stop biting things if he started writing things. They handed him a quill. He bit it in half. Then he began to write. Well, scribble. He wrote something resembling a play, but mostly it was a series of angry faces, crude stick figures fencing, and a recurring duck wearing a crown. Historians still debate whether this was early concept work for Macbeth, Richard III, or an early revenge fantasy involving waterfowl. The duck motif, by the way, was not incidental. William's teething trauma coincided with an ill-fated visit to a local pond where he attempted to bite the sky, missed, and fell into a family of very territorial geese. One of them pecked him squarely on the bottom. From that day forward, all waterfowl were cast as villains in his mind. When asked later in life about the origin of the Tempest, Will merely said, "Too much water and foul intentions." At night, William would lie in his straw-filled cradle, the eighth one, now reinforced with iron, and mutter sharp little observations into the dark. His parents mistakenly believed he was praying. He was rehearsing. By the age of 2, his teeth had fully emerged, and with them, a fully weaponized vocabulary. He was banned from 3 nurseries for unsolicited monologues. He was asked to leave a puppet show for heckling with unmatched eloquence. And at one particularly memorable christening, he interrupted the priest by standing, yes, standing, on the altar and declaring, "Lo, I have tasted life, and it tastes under-seasoned." He was slapped, then applauded, then slapped again. It was at this point that Mary Shakespeare decided to keep a diary of William's sayings. It read like a cross between a glossary of insults, a manifesto for the emotionally constipated, and a cookbook written entirely in metaphor. One entry dated year 3 post-birth reads, "Today, William accused the cat of lacking ambition, then attempted to stage a play entitled Claudius, Prince of Majorque. We fear this one may be beyond help." And still they loved him. He was their strange little storm, their hurricane in hose, their bitey bardic baby. Behind the phrase, TM, biting wit. Origin, attributed to William Shakespeare, aged 11 months, after chewing through 3 chair legs and calling a nun spiritually soggy. Modern use describes clever humor that makes people laugh, then cry a little afterward. Often used to justify why your cousin Sharon was disinvited from Christmas. Chapter 3, Knock Knock. Who's there? Me, always. By the age of 4, William Shakespeare had already accomplished more than most toddlers could dream of. He had successfully weaponized his teething phase, insulted half the clergy of Warwickshire, and begun developing an emotional dependency on metaphors. But it wasn't until he stumbled into the world's first dad joke that his career as the accidental architect of English comedy truly began. It started, as many tragedies do, with an attempt at subtlety. One rainy afternoon, while the family huddled indoors and the town of Stratford was in the middle of its 7th consecutive week of mud-based street flooding, a popular Elizabethan pastime, young Will found himself pacing the halls of the Shakespeare home with something on his mind. That something, unfortunately, was a joke. Not a proper grown-up joke. No clever pun about oxen or witty limerick involving milkmaids. No, this was something far more dangerous. The primitive, groan-inducing seedling of what would one day be called the dad joke. "Knock, knock," he whispered to the wooden door of the pantry. There was no response, which is exactly what he expected from a pantry. That's the thing about knock-knock jokes. They're as dependent on audience compliance as they are on poor judgment. He tried again, louder this time. Knock, knock. Still silence. Then, to his surprise, the door creaked open on its own, an act which Will interpreted not as coincidence, but divine timing. "Who's there?" he asked the empty pantry. His mother, Mary, standing in the kitchen, gave him a wary glance. He smiled. "Me." "Me who?" He turned dramatically, hands raised, eyes wide with self-satisfaction, and shouted, "Me, always." And then he bowed to the apples. No one laughed. Not a single person in that kitchen chuckled, chortled, guffawed, or even inhaled sharply through the nose in an attempt to pretend they found it clever. There was simply a long, quiet moment in which Mary considered the possibility that her son might be possessed by a particularly annoying court jester. His father, John, finally broke the silence by muttering, "Well, that was something." To which Will replied, "Comedy, father. I hath invented it." The phrase "knock knock" quickly became a fixture in the Shakespeare household, much to everyone's dismay. William began experimenting with variations such as "knock knock. Who's there? Cabbage? Cabbage who? Cabbage not thy questions, mother, lest thou choke on curiosity. Knock knock. Who's there? To. To who? To whom, dear brother?" The last one earned him a cuff to the ear and a lifelong sense of grammatical superiority. What William didn't realize at the time, because he was 4 and too busy constructing dramatic tension with cupboard doors, was that he had just stumbled into one of the most persistent and controversial comedic formats in history. Historians now agree that Will's knock-knock joke was the first of its kind. Not because no one had ever knocked on a door and introduced themselves before, but because no one had ever done it with the specific intention of being smug about it. This singular act reshaped the trajectory of humor forever. The line between clever wordplay and unbearable punnery had been crossed, and no one, not even the Tudors, could put it back. By 5, Will had written an entire knock-knock-themed puppet play entitled Much Ado About Doors, featuring the recurring characters Knox, a door salesman with existential dread, and Whom, a pedantic owl with trust issues. Audiences were, as the reviews put it, confused but oddly compelled. A few even applauded, possibly out of politeness or fear. The play ended with a groundbreaking bit of fourth wall breaking in which Knox knocks on the front of the puppet theatre and shouts, "Knock, knock!" only for the audience to yell, "Who's there?" in accidental unison. To which Knox replies, "You, laughing, at me, finally." The show was banned in 5 parishes for promoting door-centric sorcery. But for Will, it was a breakthrough. He had found his comedic voice, a voice that was equal parts pompous and pun-loving, layered in satire but rooted in groan-worthy setups. It didn't matter that most of the village elders declared it unholy mirth, or that the mayor once described Will's sense of humor as a blight upon sensibility and all good doors. William pressed on. He began testing his jokes on livestock. Cows were unimpressed. Sheep remained stoic. Goats, however, laughed or sneezed. It was hard to tell. Will took their reaction as validation and proclaimed loudly and often, "Goats get me." He eventually founded what he called the League of Laughing Beasts, a theatrical society consisting entirely of himself, 2 goats, a disgruntled cat named Geraldine, and an audience of insects. Their debut production, Knock Knock, a farce in 5 acts, featured exactly 1 joke, told repeatedly, louder each time, until the cat left in disgust and the goats ate the script. Critics, i.e. his Aunt Mabel, declared it a shrill and redundant affair, yet oddly catchy. Years later, when accused of lowbrow humor by rival playwrights, namely Ben Jonson, who once referred to knock-knock jokes as verbal burlesque for the unshaved masses, Will stood firm. "Laughter," he said, "requires courage and doors, And with that he continued to sneak knock-knock references into everything from shopping lists to funeral eulogies. It became his calling card, his curse, his one true comedic compass. Even in adulthood, as his works gained literary acclaim, Will couldn't resist the urge. Many now believe that Macbeth's infamous knocking scene, where the porter hears mysterious raps at the gate, is in fact a coded reference to his earliest joke. The line, "Knock, knock, who's there?" in the name of Beelzebub, is, when viewed through this lens, perhaps the world's first demonic dad joke. Behind the phrase, "Mes knock knock." Origin, first muttered by William Shakespeare while harassing a pantry door into answering existential questions. Modern use, the cornerstone of painfully punny jokes used by fathers, uncles, and that one colleague from accounts who keeps trying to lighten the mood at every staff meeting.